Operator, today's conference is scheduled to begin in approximately 5 minutes. Until that time, your lines will again be placed on hold. Thank you for your patience. I now turn the call over to Ms. Elaine Arkin.
Well, thank you so much, and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for the Connect and Explore webinar this afternoon. As you heard, I'm Elaine Arkin with the Coordinating Center, and I'll be facilitating the call this afternoon. Our special spotlight today is called Looking Back and Looking Forward, 9 years of school district wellness policy implementation. And in addition to our presentation, just after that, we'll have time for you to ask questions of our speaker. So anytime you have questions, you can put them in the chat room, and we'll be monitoring those. We'll also have a brief preview of upcoming NCCOR events at APHA and beyond, so stay tuned for that. If you have a question, it goes right here where you can see from the arrow to the chat box. Also, if you need technical assistance, let us know using that same chat box, and we'll get back to you quickly. And if you have trouble logging into the webinar but can hear us on the phone, please email us at NCCOR, NCCOR, at F as in Frank, HI360.org, and we'll work with you to resolve the problem and get you on the webinar. Finally, one important technical issue. If you're listening to our webinar using your computer speakers, please turn down or mute your computer microphone. This will greatly reduce the potential for background noise since we have so many people joining us today. So thanks a lot, everyone. We'll also be live tweeting during the webinar today. If you are on Twitter or other social media, we encourage you to join the conversation using the hashtag ConnectExplore that you can see on the screen and following the Twitter handle at NCCOR. Today's speaker is Jamie Chriqui. We're very pleased to have Dr. Chriqui, who is a professor of health policy and administration and co-director of the Health Policy Center in the Institute for Health Research and Policy at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health. Her research focus is on studying obesity and other chronic disease-related policies nationwide and their impacts on communities, schools, and individual behaviors. She's been a member of 2 recent IOM obesity prevention committees. She's a member of the Community Prevention Services Task Force and has numerous policy research grants and publications. She was recently awarded a new grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to serve as co-PI for a Policies for Action research hub focusing on children's health and weight issues. Now, before we get started with Dr. Chriqui's presentation, we just want to start with a brief poll. If you would, the poll should be coming up on your screen, and if you would just quickly answer one question. Are you familiar with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Wellness Policy Final Rule, which was issued in July? So that'll give Dr. Chriqui a little bit of understanding of who you are listening today. We see a pretty good split here. Okay, well, thank you all for participating, and now that you are used to being a little interactive with us, please do use the chat box as well. So at this point, if we can get that, there we go. I'd like to turn it over to Jamie for our Spotlight segment.
Great. Thanks very much, Elaine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. I know some of you that have signed on for today's call, so hello to those of you that I do know and others. It's a pleasure to be chatting with you today. As Elaine mentioned, I'm at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the study that I'm presenting on today, we're in our 10th year now, and we've been funded through a number of different organizations to do this work. It's a real example of an NCCOR collaborative project at its heart. Our funding for this project has come from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, most recently from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and also we do a companion study in all state laws on the areas related to school wellness through funding also from the National Cancer Institute. So I think this was one of the very first NCCOR collaborative projects that cut across the NCCOR funders. So we're real pleased to have an opportunity to share some of the results with you today. I'm going to briefly tell you I'm glad we did that poll because after 9+ years of having this wellness policy mandate, I live and breathe this stuff in my sleep, so I just assume everybody else does too. But I'm glad we did the poll because clearly about 2/3 of the people on the call today are maybe a little bit less familiar with the federal requirements. So I will give you a little history of the federal wellness policy requirements, talk about our research that we've been doing, and really highlight findings that we've had over the first 9 years of the wellness policy mandate. And then as Elaine mentioned earlier, we will take questions at the end. We've allowed for about 20 minutes of time at the end of the session for questions, so please do put your questions into the chat box. So in terms of the history, the Wellness Policy Mandate really started with the Child Nutrition and WIC Reauthorization Act of 2004, and it was effective beginning with school year 2006 to 7, and it applies to all school districts in the country that participate in the federal child nutrition programs. So that would include your National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, After School Snacks, Summer Food Service, the Milk Program, so on and so forth. The original law as written was pretty vague. As you can see here, I've included basically the language from the original law. It was truly just goals for nutrition education, physical activity, and other school-based activities related to wellness, guidelines for food sold or served, an assurance that reimbursable meals met the federal standards at the time, some implementation plans, and involvement of 6 key stakeholders in policy development. The next iteration of the Wellness Policy Mandate happened in 2010, and is with the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010, which reauthorized the wellness policy requirement. I've highlighted in blue for you basically the new components that were added to the wellness policy provisions, and it basically expanded the role of the 6 key stakeholders to include not just development but also implementation, review, and updating, having more of a transparency component to it such that school districts would have to inform and update the public on the content and implementation activities, and then measuring and reporting on implementation. And also, it was the first time that it actually provided USDA with the authority to promulgate regulations that were more detailed than the federal legislation. For those of you familiar with legislation in any form, you know that it's typically pretty vague and that the real heart and details come into implementation regulations, and that's exactly what's happened here. So actually, in July of this year, the USDA issued a final rule. It's published in the Federal Register. I've got the citation for you up here on this slide, and I believe that NCCOR can make that available to you after the call as well, a link to that. But it expanded from the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act some of the elements in the wellness policy requirements. Particularly, the goals for nutrition are no longer just nutrition education, but it's also nutrition promotion and education. Importantly, these goals for nutrition promotion, education, physical activity, and other activities are to be used using evidence-based strategies. This is new language that was included in the final rule that had not been in the prior legislation. It also updated the guideline requirements for food sold or served on school campuses during the day to not only be consistent with federal meal standards, but also now to be consistent with federal USDA Smart Snack standards, which is another resource perhaps that NCCOR could share with you after the call as well. And then have guidelines for other foods that are provided during the day, such as, somehow my slide got moved, guidelines for other foods that are provided during the day outside of the mealtime or through vending machines or stores or things like that. It also included a component on policies on marketing, restricting marketing to only foods and beverages that meant smart snacks. It codified into regulation and expansion of the key stakeholders who were to be involved with development, implementation, review, and updating to now specifically include PE teachers and school health professionals. There are 2 new additions to the original 6. Having triennial assessments, updating the policy as necessary, making it available to the public, and establishing a point person in the district responsible for oversight of wellness policy and wellness policy reporting. So these items in blue are all new in the final rule. If you're not familiar with it and you're in a school district or in a school, I encourage you to take a look at those requirements. And USDA actually is a really nice one-page fact sheet summarizing the requirements of the federal rule, and hopefully NCCOR can make that available after the call as well. So what have we been doing for the past 9 years in studying research in this area? We've been conducting what I believe to be the largest ongoing nationwide evaluation of school district wellness policies. I see Alicia Stahlberg on the call, and I know she did one of the very original initial baseline studies of wellness policy adoption back in 2006. But I think ours is the largest ongoing nationwide evaluation of policies in this area. It's been an annual rolling cross-sectional sample, so we don't have a longitudinal panel. We haven't followed the same districts over time. Rather, we have a new cross-section of districts every year. We range from about 500 to 800 districts per year in our sample, and it's a nationally representative sample. Although, as I'll tell you in a minute, for school year 14-15, which is the last year of data we have, our sample frame changed a little bit, and we had about 500 districts for this past year. We actually collected hard copies of all district policies and all associated superintendent's regulations and procedures, as well as any policies that were embedded by reference, including state school board association ones or model policies or state laws that were embedded into the district policies themselves. So it was we actually compiled all these policies for all 500 to 800 districts every year and actually evaluated every single policy in hard copy. These were not based on surveys. On average, we have about 200 different measures that we look at across the required elements in the wellness policies. We also added in categories for physical education and staff wellness because we felt that those were important categories for school wellness provisions, and PE in particular because it's the easiest way to engage students in physical activity during the school day. All of our policies were analyzed by 2 coders every year. Our original tool was adapted from Marlene Schwartz's tool at the UConn Rudd Center on Food Policy and Obesity, known as WellSat. Many of you may be familiar with that. WellSat at this point, WellSat 2.0, has about 50 items. We have over 200 items at this point, closer to 250 items in our current tool. Our tool is really intended for research purposes. The other thing that makes us unique from WellSat is we code every single policy separately for each grade of applicability. So policies that are applicable at the elementary level, the middle level, and the high school level, primarily because our policy data over time has been linked with school survey data at the elementary, middle, and high school level. So we wanted to make sure we had the proper linkages going on. All the policy provisions, all 200 provisions I mentioned, are coded really on an ordinal scale. So we look for definitively required or strong policy provisions or suggested or encouraged type provisions versus 0 being a no provision. In the competitive food or snack policy area, through 2013-14, we had our gold standard measurement being to meet the IOM 2007 standards, and then starting with school year 14-15, we updated that to include smart snacks. This really doesn't matter for your purposes, just anybody who's interested in the details of our coding relative to WellSat. It's very similar, we just have a lot more variables we look at. And then we also, as you'll see in a minute, we also assess the proportion of the 200 plus items that a district policy has included versus the proportion of the items that are definitively required, and that's strength. So what have we found over time? All the historical data that I'll show you that cover through school year 13-14 are presented in our latest MyGraph, which is available under your web links in the Connect and Explore website here. So if you're in the panel that you could see the chat box right above it are web links, and there's a link to the report. So all the data through school year 13-14 are in this report. Data that I'll present on 14-15 are new data that have not yet been released, but I'm happy to share them with you all today. So the first chart shows you historically the adoption of policies over time as well as the components of those policies. As you can see, by about school year 13-14, approximately 95% of all districts in the country, these data are nationally weighted, 95% of all districts in the country had a wellness policy in place who should have had one, meaning they participate in the federal child nutrition programs. And most of those policies did include goals for nutrition education, physical activity. They also include physical education, even though it wasn't required, school meal, as well as some implementation evaluation. The place that most of the policies fell short was in the competitive food arena in particular. When we look at our data for school year 14-15, we actually have a different sample. Our sample here is based off of the percentage of district policies for school food authorities nationwide, and it's linked to the USDA School Nutrition and Meal Cost Study districts. So it's a slightly different frame, but you can see here that the provisions are very comparable in terms of their prevalence, as well as in terms of the overall prevalence of district policies. So the story really hasn't changed, quite honestly, since about school year 2008-9. There was a slightly slow uptake in the initial 2 to 3 years of the policy mandate, and from that point on, things have been pretty stagnant over time. In terms of the proportion of items that are addressed out of the 200 plus items that we look at, so you'll recall from the prior slide, we have over 90% of districts or 80% of districts addressing lots of different provisions. But when we look at the actual components of those provisions being addressed, that's where we see things starting to fall off. Our most commonly addressed category is nutrition education, followed by, to some extent, competitive foods, even though they're not required in a lot of policies. When they are, they address a fair amount of things, as well as school meals and physical activity. But as you can see, out of the 200 or so items that we address, most of them fall below 50% mark. When we look at school year 14-15 data, it's very similar in terms of percentages, although starting with 14-15, there's a lot more attention to school meals. In terms of nutrition education, if you're interested, the things that are most commonly addressed in nutrition education tend to be, hold on, I have a note for myself here, tend to be having goals for nutrition education as required by law, having a curriculum for each grade, and teaching about behavior-focused skills. When we look at evaluation and implementation, which is the next item on the list, we see the most common items are having a plan for implementation and a plan for evaluation, or at least a goal for measuring implementation. In physical activity for every grade level and having physical activity opportunities throughout the day is common. In the communications category, that's where we put our stakeholder involvement. So we see that quite a bit, particularly stakeholders involved in development, less so about involved in review and updating. And then on marketing, we see marketing of healthy choices as being pretty prevalent. We don't see restrictions on marketing or advertising of items that don't meet smart snacks. That's not very prevalent at all. And then we do see a fair amount of policies addressing reporting on compliance and meeting wellness policy goals. When we look at policy strength, it's even worse than our overall comprehensiveness. So while about 50% of all district policies address nutrition education provisions, less than that address require nutrition education provisions. And the same with everything across the board. So things start to, most policies, basically what you can garner from this, most policies address a lot of things, but they don't require them. And given that there isn't definitive funding allocated for implementation of these policies, that's probably not surprising. And our data for school year 14-15 are very comparable here as well. And the same categories of items tend to be the most prevalent items that we see. This is just a table from our report, and I will note, don't be overwhelmed by our report. It's 196 pages, but 151 pages of that are tables in the appendices. If you download the PDF version of it, there are bookmarks in it so you can easily locate any section or table you're interested in. What I took here were our overall comprehensiveness and strength scores just so you can see whether we see any differences over time and within category by various socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. Generally, we don't actually see changes within category in the free and reduced price lunch category for these policies, and this has been a consistent story over time. We have seen improvement over time, but as you can see, their policy strength and comprehensiveness are not holistically different across different categories of free and reduced price lunch or FCS. The places where we do see a little bit of difference tend to be in district size and region, and to some extent based off of race and ethnicity of the district students. But if you want more details on this, there's, as I said, 151 pages of tables with lots of details, and every single provision that we analyze through school year 13-14 is captured in the full report. So since many of you are involved or less familiar with the new federal rule, I want to hone in on some specific components from the federal rule that we have actually been tracking in the Wellness Policy Study using our school year 14-15 data. We didn't have advance notice, of course, of what was in the final rule, but we used the data that or information that was in the proposed rule that was issued in, I forget if it was issued in 2014 or 2015. I think it was 2015 that was issued. We took the items that were in the proposed rule and started to track them. I do have to say there were some categories that we had actually been tracking well before USDA even issued the proposed rule related to reporting and evaluation. So we actually have had data in that area for about since 2010. So we have a lot of data on the reporting, evaluation, implementation categories, even preceding USDA's involvement in this area. So as I mentioned, the final rule included a component for wellness policy teams. You have to designate a school district official. LEA, by the way, is a local education agency. I use district for short, but that's how they're referred to in the federal regulations. So it's to have a district level official or a school level official responsible for ensuring compliance, and then to indicate who's responsible for oversight within the district, and then specifically to have 8 different stakeholders involved in development, implementation, reviewing, and updating, with 2 new categories that are added with the final rule, being PE teachers and school health professionals. I'm going to focus on this last category on this next slide. So basically what we have here is the percent of district policies for school food authorities nationwide that address stakeholder involvement in development, review and evaluation, updating of the policy. If it meets Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, it means it includes all 8 stakeholders I just mentioned. If it is a requirement but it doesn't meet Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, this orange, dark orange bar, that means that they have the original 6 stakeholders required to be involved in development, review, evaluation, and or updating. And if they have a weak provision, it means they don't either include all 6 stakeholders or they encourage it. And then the blue bars mean they don't address it at all. And so as you can see here, as of school year 14-15, about 36% of district policies for school food authorities nationwide specifically require stakeholder involvement in the development of the policies, but only 14% actually meet all 8 categories, and the numbers go down as we go through review, evaluation, updating. So this is definitely an easy area to tackle going forward. It doesn't require necessarily new resources, but it definitely involves more stakeholders in the process of wellness policies. The next component, as you might recall, is that the goals for the wellness policies now must be evidence-based, and they specifically now must include nutrition promotion, in addition to the original requirements for nutrition education, physical activity, and other school-based activities. So I'm going to hone in here on nutrition promotion as one example of some data we've got so far. And there are 2 things that we capture in our study related to nutrition promotion. One is including strategies for, to increase student participation in school food meals. So, for example, having taste tests, grab and go, or fun on the run, including closed campuses on high schools, requiring that meals be made appealing. Other strategies might be placement of salad bars at the beginning of the food line as opposed to at the end. And then we also look at promotion or marketing of healthy food choices. So again, for school year 14-15, we see that about a little less than 1 in 5 district policies for school food authorities nationwide definitively require that schools have strategies for increasing student participation in the school meal programs. My son is in high school, and I'm glad to report that his school is doing taste tests and just did one recently where they're actually going to be offering some new food offerings starting next calendar year based on the taste tests. So I was excited that we're seeing some of this in practice. However, only about 1/3 of the district's policies actually encourage it as opposed to require it. So part of that could be resources, but it is something that's being addressed by a fair amount of districts, but it's not definitively required. The marketing of healthy options or promotion of healthy options is less frequently addressed than in strategies for increasing participation. As you can see, only about 7% of district policies for school year 14-15 actually required policy or schools to have strategies for addressing promotion and marketing of healthy options. Now recall, the federal rule is not effective until school year 17-18. So what I'm providing are baseline data just to show you where districts stand as of school year 14-15, so you see where there are some opportunities for continued improvement going forward up until the timeline of the implementation of the final federal rule. In terms of some other categories, standards for food and beverages provided but not sold. So this would include things like classroom parties or food as reward. So I just want to show you there what we see. So as of school year 14-15, we see that about 13% of district policies for school food authorities nationwide definitively limit the use of food as a reward or taking away food mealtime as punishment. About 1/4 of district policies encourage it but don't definitively require it. On classroom parties, we see more than half of district policies for school food authorities nationwide encourage restrictions on food being provided in classroom parties. And interestingly, Dr. Lindsay Turner and I have done a study on this a couple of years ago where we looked at policies that encourage restrictions on classroom parties and linked them with elementary school practices. And we found that even if you just encourage it in state law under district policy, that schools are more likely to change their party practices because they at least have a policy frame from which to work. So this is one area where encouraging something seems to be associated with some definitive school practices. And the Smart Snacks, they're just starting to roll into the district policies. In terms of assessment and reporting, this is a whole new category. There were some initial provisions in the prior legislation, but it wasn't as definitive as the final rule. So most of what I've got here on the screen is mainly new, and we have a lot of data in the reporting evaluation area. If you look in our report, you'll see a whole host of different items that we examine in this area, and I'll show you here on this slide. Basically, the story relative to reporting is that most district policies don't address it. Everything that's in blue means that the district policies are not addressing it. The things we see most commonly required in district policies are reporting back to the district on local compliance and or implementation, to some extent reporting on the extent to which the district is meeting their overall goals or progress in meeting the goals. Lesser, so only about 20 to 30% of district policies explicitly require that the district report to the public on wellness policy implementation, a little bit on school meals and involvement of stakeholders. But no district policies so far had included language that they submit their policy to the state. This is something they're going to have to be doing going forward. The new federal rule included the provision about an official leading the team. That's not something districts had done before, so this will definitely be an area for changes. The district policies generally don't address at all how the public can get engaged. So there's lots of opportunities in the reporting and monitoring and oversight area going forward between now and 2017 when the final rule, federal rule is fully effective. And then marketing, this is a big area that people, I think, made the most they were the most attuned to relative to the wellness policy rule. And there are really two components. It's really schools are not allowed to market or advertise foods and beverages that are, or excuse me, they're only allowed to market or advertise foods and beverages that are consistent with Smart Snacks. So they can only market and promote healthy options that align with Smart Snacks, and they have to prohibit the marketing or advertising of foods that don't align with Smart Snacks. It only applies to events that are occurring during school hours. So one of these charts I already showed you. I showed you this one earlier, but I didn't show you the part about prohibiting marketing of items that don't align with Smart Snacks. And as you can see here, only 21% of district policies for school food authorities nationwide had a policy as of school year 14-15 that even addressed restricting marketing of unhealthy options. 14% of district policies specifically prohibited them, and 7% more encouraged prohibiting but didn't definitively prohibit them. 79% of the district policies for school food authorities nationwide as of school year 14-15 did not address this topic at all. And only 68% of district policies did not address marketing or promotion of only healthy options. So this is another area content-wise where there's a lot of opportunity for improvement going forward in the next couple of years. So I am wrapping up here, and just wanted to share with you a couple of resources. As you know, in the chat, above the chat are the web links. One is to our report, which you see here. It's also available fully from our website here, and all new products we'll be releasing from this study will be posted to this website, so I encourage you to follow up there. We also have a series of qualitative studies that we've been doing, and we also do monitoring of state fundraiser exemptions on a quarterly basis, and we post all of those to this GoUIC website. Our historical work in this area, including our prior monographs and reports and a series of briefs that we did with CDC, are available from our Bridging the Gap website as well. Caitlin Merlot at the CDC shared with me a couple of additional slides that she thought might be helpful for you. The first is, as you'll recall that I mentioned earlier, the federal rule now includes a provision that the goals for wellness policies must be evidence-based strategies. And so CDC released this report a couple of years ago. I believe it was in 2014. It was School Health Guidelines to Promote Healthy Eating and Physical Activity, and it included 99 evidence-based guidelines and 33 evidence-based strategies. I believe CDC is planning to update this, but it might be a good starting point for districts who are looking at their policies and wanting to determine if their strategies that they currently have are evidence-based or not. And this is the URL for that volume in the MMWR. In addition, as I mentioned, I collaborated with the folks at CDC a couple of years ago, and we did 2 sets of briefs on different components of wellness policies. It includes a lot of our historical data, but importantly, at the end of each brief, it has strategies that you can take depending on your role, if you're at the state, if you're at the district, or at the school levels, and how you can engage yourself in that particular area. It also includes links to a number of resources that might be useful to you as well as you move forward with the evidence-based components. And then finally, here are a couple of additional URLs for you. I mentioned the WellSat tool at the UConn Red Center for Food Policy and Obesity. If you want to track policies in your own district or in your state, this is a great, easy-to-use tool. It's only got about 50 items on it. The Alliance for Healthier Generation has a whole host of tools and other items that will be useful for you. And Action for Healthy Kids also has a resource and tool in place as well. I completely apologize. I neglected to put the USDA link up here that has the one-page fact sheet. So hopefully Michelle and Elaine, you all can send that out to participants after the meeting. So with that, I will call it to a close, and I think I am exactly on time. And this is my contact information. My colleague Betsy Pikarts, who is the project manager for the study and is the lead legal and policy analyst for all of our district and state policy work. Her information is here as well. She might be quicker to respond to questions than I will. So I encourage you, if you have any questions for us, to reach out to both of us. And with that, I will turn it back over to Elaine and Michelle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That's, wow, a wonderful amount of information in a short amount of time. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of questions that have come in from participants. And as a reminder for those of you who are listening in, if you would like to ask a question, you can see the arrow to the chat box if you would fill it in there. So, Jamie, just to get started, by the way, the questions range from clarification of some aspects of the rule to what it means for localities. There are questions from practitioners and from researchers. But just generally to get us started, for people who are working at a school district level and want to move forward with the new federal rule that came out this summer, where do you recommend that they start to review existing policies relative to the rule and where there are opportunities to improve?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Elaine, and to the audience. There are lots of places you can start. First of all, as I mentioned, I will ask the folks at NCCOR to share with you the link to the one-page fact sheet that USDA has prepared on the final rule. I think that'll be a really useful resource. And again, I apologize for not including a link in my presentation. But I would definitely review that in comparison to your actual policy in your district, just to see sort of as a starting point for a checklist. You could also compare your policy using the WellSat tool just to see where you stand on different items. I would definitely look at that CDC resource that I presented on the evidence-based strategies as a starting point, just to see the extent to which you have evidence-based strategies built into your goals for nutrition, education, physical activity, and some of the other components. The other place you can also check is to make sure that when your wellness policy talks about the sale of foods outside of the meal program, that language specifically aligns with the federal Smart Snack standards or embeds the Smart Snack standards or points to the Smart Snack standards directly and says you must follow these standards. That's an easy thing to do. Although districts are following it on their own, the wellness policies are required to address this issue, so you want to make sure your wellness policy is updated to reflect that updated language. On the reporting, there's lots of things that can be done on reporting, evaluation, and oversight and monitoring, in particular starting by identifying a lead person in the district responsible for wellness policy oversight and monitoring, and then maybe having teams throughout your schools responsible for reporting up to that lead person. All this information is in the federal rule, and it also will be on that one-page fact sheet that I mentioned. But those are easy places to start from my perspective. It starts with really understanding what's in your current policy. You know, these policies have been on the books now for 9 to 10 years, and so many of you may not have even been involved with their initial policy development. You might recall from my earlier slides that we haven't seen much change in the policy content since school year 2008 to 9, so chances are maybe your district hasn't even revisited your policy. We do tend to see, as you might recall, the federal rule required a triennial assessment of the wellness policy for updating and revision. We actually do tend to see that policies, if they get updated and revised, it tends to be on a 3-year cycle. So that's something else you can look for. But I would definitely start by convening your wellness committee and reviewing the policy to see the extent to which it does or does not align with the new federal requirements, and give yourself this next year to try and get it aligned.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. And just 2 questions that are relevant to clarify what you've just said. There was a question of clarification. They're coming in so quickly, I'm losing
I know.
and that is the LEA. Is that a new role within the district or an additional set of responsibilities for someone who is an existing employee?
It depends on how the district chooses to handle it, is my understanding. The federal rule did not specify who within the district would have to be given authority for this. So I believe it's up to each district to make their decision about who will be the person responsible as the point person on wellness in the district.
Thank you. And another question just of clarification, or actually I think this would be is a great question. Are there any models of strong policies to review?
That is a really good question. There is another website that's been pulled together by the NANA, the Nutrition and Activity Alliance Coalition, and I apologize, I don't have the URL handy right now. If anybody, Renee or anybody from Voices is on the call and has access to Colin's website and you want to put in the chat box, we can share that with everyone. But there is a new website that has a lot of wellness policy tools from many of the groups that I showed you earlier, but I believe it also has some links to model policies, although I'm not sure if they're yet updated to reflect the new federal rule language. But that would be a good place to start. In addition, USDA, I believe, on their website where they have links about the federal rule, will also have models posted there if they're not already.
Okay, well, great. And now another question of clarification. Can you clarify whether the language states that these categories of stakeholders are only permitted to participate, or whether there's a requirement that all of these categories of stakeholders participate?
So the language that's in there is that the stakeholders, I believe, must participate in the development, involvement of key stakeholders in the development, implementation, review, and updating. And so that now includes 8 different groups of stakeholders. The original 6 were parents, students, school food authority, school board, and administrators. And now with the final rule, or with Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, and then codified in the final rule, it added in PE teachers and school health professionals. So you really should have a district-wide wellness policy advisory group or wellness policy council or health advisory group that includes all 8 of those stakeholders involved in the ongoing implementation, review, and updating of the policy.
Okay, and more on the policies. Do charter schools have to comply with the wellness policies?
If the charter school participates in any of the federal child nutrition programs, and I'm not sure if you were on in the very beginning, but the federal child nutrition programs include the National School Lunch Program, the School Breakfast Program, the Summer Food Service Program, After School Snacks Program, and the Milk Program. I may be forgetting 1 or 2. So if any charter school participates in any of those programs, then yes, they are required to comply with the rule as well.
Okay.
We often, in our district policy collection, our national sample is based off of districts, and districts sometimes will include an individual charter school because they are considered their own district, and they participate in the federal child nutrition programs.
Okay. So then in addition to reporting by district, do you have state-by-state data?
I wish. I believe that was Katya who asked that question. I wish I had the resources over the years to have done state representative samples. We did not have that, so our data are nationally representative. Having said that, I mentioned earlier that we also compile data on all 50 states and the District of Columbia's state codified laws, statutes, and administrative regulations, and everything embedded into those state laws. So we have all 200 plus items we look at the district level. We also look at the state level, and we've been doing that over time. Actually, if you want to stay tuned, and maybe it'll be a future NCCOR webinar, we are going to be releasing a MyGraph similar to the district one we released that'll focus entirely on our state law data. But Katya, unfortunately, I haven't had the resources to do state representative samples of wellness policies. It'd be really nice to do that if I could. Some states do have it, so depending on what state you're in, I believe like Maryland, for example, studies this. A group in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, I believe, have been studying this. So there are different pockets of states across the country that have been doing this. You might want to contact the Red Center because a lot of those states are using WellSat to analyze district policies in their state, and they might be able to put you in touch with different states who have been using WellSat to do statewide assessments.
Okay, and moving right along, so can you explain more about the differences by race, ethnicity, geography for district implementation of wellness policies?
Sure. So this report and the presentation I gave today is just on policy content as opposed to implementation and practice, and that is obviously something we're all interested in. My colleagues and I at Bridging the Gap have issued a number of papers over the years where we've linked the policy data with school practices. So if you're interested in some of those, I'd be happy to share with the NCCOR folks a bibliography of some of those papers. But in terms of the data that I presented today, we do see some regional differences. We see that in particular, the western region in the country tends to have stronger policies and more comprehensive. As I mentioned, we don't actually see, and this holds up in for those of you who are quantitative people, this holds up in regression models too. We don't see free and reduced price lunch popping out as a driving factor of strength or weakness. And I think my speculation there is that the districts who perhaps were in lower resource communities, in some ways they may have had some less pushback on certain things just because they, for example, they're not selling a lot of competitive foods, so it's easier for them to have some provisions in there on different things, but they struggle with implementation of the policies more than getting the policy adopted. We do see some differences by size. As you can imagine, smaller rural districts tend to have a harder time with some of this than larger urban districts. And we do see more diverse districts tend to address a lot more provisions than primarily white or Caucasian districts.
So, Jamie, I want you to know that there are a lot more questions than we can answer, and everyone, we will ask Jamie to address these by email. We'll be posting those answers. I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. A lot about making available candy and dessert fundraisers, fundraisers and access to outside school foods that are delivered on campus, a whole lot of implementation issues around smart stacks. So very lively questions. We'll all look forward to those answers. But I do want to turn it over to a couple of questions from researchers. And one was, how did you assess the strengths of the policies?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So if you're familiar with WellSat, and if you're not familiar with WellSat, it's a very comparable measure. It's basically, so out of our 200 plus items, it's the proportion of the items that we evaluated that are definitively required. And so within a category, for example, let me just I don't know if I can go back here. Within a category like nutrition education, we had 9 items that we evaluated, and what proportion of those 9 items in nutrition education were definitively required versus overall. And so let me go back to that table here. I'm slowly getting there. So here, oh, whoops, my slides are moving too fast for my thing here. Oh well, you know what I mean. What proportion of the items are definitively required is how we measure strength. Comprehensiveness is what proportion of the items within a category, so like nutrition education or overall, the 200 plus items, are simply addressed, meaning they're encouraged or required regardless.
Okay, and just related to that, another question for relevance for researchers on the phone. With this new federal rule, where are opportunities to improve the research from your point of view, in addition to collecting the state data?
Yeah, so some real opportunities going forward are to measure progress that districts are making in aligning with the federal rule. The data that I presented here was simply just a baseline assessment, even prior to the federal rule being released, because this was based off of 14-15 data. Where do districts even stand? So going forward from a research perspective, we need to be able to look at and examine the extent to which districts are even complying with the federal rule. That would be the starting point.
Okay.
And then And then the next part of that would be to do longitudinal study. The other thing I didn't have resources for besides being able to do state representative samples of districts, the other thing that would be really nice to do would be able to do a longitudinal panel over time and study a large cohort of districts over time and look at changes that may occur relative to the wellness policy in this area. Unfortunately, our funding for this as of this point in time seems to be coming to an end, but maybe we'll find a ready and willing and interested funder who might want to pick this up going forward. But as of right now, our 14-15 data may be our current last year of data for the time being.
Well, that was going to be my final question, and that's not good news. There's so much to be learned, and this is just a fabulous presentation. I think this could have been 2 hours. And again, thank you all to all of the participants who are continuing to ask wonderful questions, and we will be able to answer those after this webinar. So moving right along, and apologies, the slides seem to have a life of their own this afternoon. They're very frisky for a Monday afternoon. So bear with us. Jamie, this is, we'll also be able to post the links, and we hope that you will come back and talk with us again, because we've had such an interest from the participants. Thank you for taking time for this. I know you're very busy.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, it's just terrific. Thank you. So I want to tell you just a little bit about a few upcoming NCCOR events. First of all, there's another Connect and Explore webinar on November 10. It's part of our 3-part series on evaluating healthcare and community collaboration. You can sign up for our newsletter to get an announcement about it when the registration is open. You can see the guest speakers here. It's been just a fascinating series talking about what the healthcare community can do to link people with community resources and work together to prevent childhood obesity. So we're delighted that they are so engaged. And then we also will host our second Twitter chat to continue that conversation on healthcare community collaborations. It'll be held on November 15 at 2 p.m., co-hosted by NCCOR, the CDC Division of Nutrition and Physical Activity and Promotion Branch, and the NIH Office of Disease Prevention. So you'll be hearing from folks from a number of perspectives. It should be quite engaging. NCCOR will also be at APHA, booth 802. If you're there, we'd love to see you, have a chance to chat. And you can see that we'll be tweeting using the hashtags NCCOR at APHA and APHA 2016. So we hope to see you there. And also just wanted to alert you, there's so many sessions that we want to make sure that you know that they're sessions given by NCCOR members or related to NCCOR projects. So you can see 3 here on Monday and another 3 on Tuesday. That's just a sampling. Jamie, you're going to be giving a similar presentation on school district policies on Tuesday, right?
Yes, I'm giving that on Tuesday. Also on Monday, Betsy Pikarts, my colleague, is presenting on the state fundraiser exemption laws across the country, and I'm actually presenting a presentation similar to this one, but looking at district policy alignment with the Smart Snack standards across the country. So those are both on Monday afternoon in the 2:30 to 4 p.m. session.
Well, those are both topics. We got a lot of questions about fundraising and also a lot about smart snacks. Somebody called it a real hot tamale about policy issues. So you should have a great audience there. I hope some of our participants can join. So just quickly, if you have other questions about NCCOR or upcoming activities, please email us. And finally, again, if you are not signed up, please do sign up to hear more from NCCOR. And also you can see right here, circled in red, where NCCOR webinars will be posted. This one should be posted in the next few days, along with some of the questions that we did not have a chance to get to because there were just so many, which was just wonderful. And we want to thank you all for being with us this afternoon. We hope you'll be with us for our next webinar. Now, just before you leave, if you please take a moment to complete our brief 6-question survey. It's very quick, to help us shape future webinars and make sure we're using the best use of your time. So we're going to switch over to the feedback form now, and you can write your input directly on the screen and hit submit. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Chriqui, and we hope that all of you have a good day. Bye-bye.
This concludes today's call. You may now disconnect.